Well, let me open the event this evening by welcoming all of you to the University of Tulsa College of Law. It's always a delight to see so many people, not only from the university, not only from the law college, but from the community, from other parts of the university, colleagues from the legal profession here in Tulsa, and so many others. Let me introduce myself very briefly. I'm Robert Spoo, Chapman Professor of Law here, and also Associate Dean for Faculty Development. And I have the honor this evening of introducing two things. First of all, our Buck Colbert Franklin Memorial Civil Rights Lecture, and our lecturer for the evening, Professor Marta Tienda from Princeton University. Let me just say a few words first about the Buck Franklin Lecture, which is offered here every year. It honors one of the first African-American attorneys in Tulsa and in Oklahoma. In the aftermath of the 1921 Tulsa race riot, Buck Franklin served as really a community leader and a legal champion by assisting victims of the riot. He actually worked out of a tent because his own office and his home were destroyed during that terrible event. And he represented clients, he filed briefs, and he fought back against the injustice of the riot and the city's assault on the Tulsa black community. He won a critical court decision striking down a city ordinance designed to prevent African Americans from rebuilding their homes in Tulsa, and that's just the beginning of the tale of his many accomplishments. His son, John Hope Franklin, of course, is one of the major American historians whose many writings included the famous book From Slavery to Freedom. I should also say that we are very pleased to have in attendance two of the major donors and supporters of the Buck Franklin Lecture, and that would be Sharon Bell, who represents the Chapman Trust, and also Steve and Ellen Adelson, who I believe are also in attendance. Let me then move on to the pleasure of introducing Professor Tienda, who is our Buck Franklin lecturer this fall. The many things that one could and should say about her are just too many to say, but let me just say a few. She is currently, and has been since 1997, in the sociology department at Princeton University. She is Morris P. During 1922 professor in demographic studies there since '99, and is a research associate and formerly director of the Office of Population Research, also there. Her degrees are from Michigan State University and the University of Texas at Austin, the BA through the PhD. She has had many administrative experiences of real relevance to the things she writes on. She has honorary degrees. I don't know that I have introduced many people to date who actually have a biography already written about them, and obviously for a living person. And that is a biography by Diane O'Carroll called People Person, the story of sociologist Marta Tienda. Her research focuses on race and ethnic differences in various contexts, and she has focused on issues of demographics, of immigration, of population. Her many books, monographs, and articles and editions focus on these issues in a wide array of deployments: migrant youth, immigrant youth, Hispanics and the American future. And what I think she will be talking about in large part tonight, a particular interest of hers, is the issue of higher education and opportunities for racial and minority groups in that context. Tonight, the title of her talk will be From Diversity to Inclusion, Post-Grutter and Fisher. Professor Tienda.
Thank you. really a privilege to be here, and I hope I don't disappoint the donors. So I've never been to Tulsa before, but I've had a good time. I like anything easy. Being from the Northeast, we're not used to that. Plus, the hospitality has been terrific in every domain. Let me just clarify for the record about that biography. It's one of 10 that was funded by Sarah Lee from Sarah Lee Products. The heiress of the Sarah Lee product line, she wanted more women in science, and so they commissioned 10 biographies of women in science, 9 of which are actual scientists. And then there is this demographer they didn't know what to do with, but I'm the only one who's there that's not planetary geologist or a mathematician or a physicist. And they are intended for middle school girls to get them to go into the STEM fields. So my earrings feature prominently in the fact that I wear high heels a lot. Those kinds of things that might be of interest to girls going into science. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to, I've not spoken to a legal audience before. My brother was a student at University of Michigan Law School before he was tragically killed in a car accident in Texas on the day before my wedding. But he wanted to study immigration law and poverty law. And I hope I haven't disappointed his spirit. The University of Michigan has a memorial dinner every year, so he lives on bigger than life could ever be. That's sponsored by the African American students and the Latino students, and it's grown so much and the donation, the fund that started off as what they called a flower fund, is now a fairly substantial endowment that the University of Michigan uses to fund law students who are trying to help people studying immigration and poverty law. So it's possible to continue and create a footstep when one was taken away. So the 2003 Grutter decision and the 2013 Fisher court decisions about race-sensitive admissions have commanded so much research attention over the past several years, and consequently they've deflected attention from strategies to harness the educational benefits of diversity. I too have contributed to the plethora of of these studies about access and equity in higher education, asking not only who attends and why, but also the more difficult question of who should go and doesn't. The barriers to higher education are well documented. The leaky pipeline, the highly unequal K-12 feeder system, the lack of information about college costs, spotty counseling, weak college-going cultures at under-resourced schools, and soaring college costs. The list goes on, and it replays like refrains in popular songs. And even as the barriers to higher education persist, there appears to be good progress on one dimension, namely racial diversification of college campuses. This is not an accident, but partly the result of several hard-fought battles at the ballot box and in the courts, and partly the tailwinds of changing racial landscape of the nation. That universities value racial diversity is evident in their fierce legal defense of affirmative action as a strategy to broaden access for underrepresented groups. Following the Supreme Court decision to remand the Fisher versus University of Texas case to the Circuit Court, race-sensitive admissions remain on trial both in the court of public opinion and in the lower courts. Importantly, the decision stipulates that the reviewing court must certify that the consideration of race is very narrowly tailored and that no viable alternative that's race neutral would produce the educational benefits of diversity. It's fair to ask then whether universities are actually harnessing the pedagogic benefits of diversity. Tonight, therefore, I want to question not whether, but how institutions of higher education value diversity by asking whether its pedagogic benefits are being realized. I engage this question by focusing on inclusion, which I define as organizational strategies and practices that promote meaningful social and academic interactions among persons and groups who differ in their experiences, in their views, and their traits. My reason for pursuing this question is manifold. First, to question whether the motives for campus diversification are aligned with the pedagogic goals, and second, to question what strategies institutions of higher education can pursue to foster integration. There's mounting evidence showing how diversity promotes innovation, problem solving, and new ways of thinking in firms, but there's less evidence about whether diversity promotes integration on campus. So to begin, I'll provide a brief overview of population diversification for the nation and in higher education specifically. My goal is to illustrate the contours and especially the pace of change, both of which have implications for the prospects of maximizing inclusion on campuses. I then discuss the benefits of diverse institutions and outline the challenges to achieving meaningful integration as campuses become more racially diverse by focusing on some ethnic programming and student social interaction patterns. In closing, I question whether institutions of higher education are leveraging their diverse bodies in ways that promote inclusion and suggest an agenda for institutional leaders to capitalize on diversity. First, a note on terminology. Diversity is a sufficiently neutral term to accommodate myriad dimensions: cultural, political, economic, and of course race. Maybe it's too neutral. Increasingly, the term diversity is paired with the term inclusion as if both terms imply each other. This is what got me on this topic. But I will argue that the presumption is unwarranted. According to Lehman, the former dean of the University of Michigan at the time of the very difficult time of the decision, the word diversity is somewhat one-dimensional, connoting mainly racial heterogeneity. At least today, the word integration does a better job of capturing the special importance to our country of undoing the damaging legacy of laws and norms that artificially separated citizens from one another on the basis of race. I use the terms integration and inclusion interchangeably. Reflecting on the challenges of devising categories to meaningfully portray the nation's unprecedented diversification at the end of the 20th century, the former U.S. Census Director Kenneth Pruitt wrote, "Not in recorded history has there been a nation so demographically complex. And so it falls to us, the American citizens of the 21st century, to fashion from this diversity history's first world nation." The diversification narrative he described has continued unabated through the 21st century. In fact, the racial diversification of the U.S. population largely occurred during the last quarter of the 20th century. Between 1900 and 1950, the racial makeup of the nation was stable, largely defined in black and white. Before 1970, the Hispanic population was not differentiated from whites, but since that time, Hispanics have been identified as an ethnic group that can be of any race. The U.S. racial diversification narrative gained momentum after 1960, spurred by the resurgence of mass migration from new sending regions and high fertility of immigrants from Latin America. I don't want to dwell on the racial composition of the U.S. population, but I do want to illustrate two master trends after 1970 that have implications for the challenges and opportunities to integrate college campuses, namely the contours, but especially the pace of diversification for the reasons that I'll explain below. As an anchor for the next set of slides, which I'll display quickly for effect, just focus on the shrinking share of the white population from 80% in 1980 to 76% in 1990 to 71% in 2000 and to 62% in the most recent census. Today, less than 2/3 of U.S. residents self-identify as non-Hispanic white. So after decades of relative stability, the U.S. racial landscape changed quite quickly. In the span of just 40 years, the non-white population share rose from less than 18% to 38%. And the numbers involved are formidable because the U.S. population grew 51% over the period, from 203 million to over 308 million in 2010. Of course, these aggregate trends belie further heterogeneity by birthplace, nationality, religion, language, etc. But for simplicity, the broad racial categories serve to illustrate my point about the pace of change, which has implications for the emergence and the persistence of group boundaries. These trends are not irreversible, so the question is whether diversity will undermine social unity. Pruitt put the question more philosophically, quote, "How can we live together justly?" unquote. And if diversity and discrimination have often been joined together in American history, asked Pruitt, will the pairing grow weaker or stronger as we grow more diverse? Restated through the lens of higher education, are diverse universities stronger than their homogeneous counterparts, as they are alleged to be? or are their student bodies pulling apart in invisible and yet equally profound ways? As important, given the diversity rationale used to defend the use of race-sensitive admissions in Grutter, are post-secondary institutions harnessing the educational benefits of diversity, or is cultural heterogeneity largely symbolic? How demographic diversity plays out in higher education partly depends on concurrent social trends, and it's particularly noteworthy that after 1970, the diversification narrative unfolded against the backdrop of rising economic inequality and stagnant social mobility. These trends also shape how societies and universities adapt to their multicultural futures, and importantly, whether diversity undermines or fosters inclusion. In a recent op-ed piece, Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz declared equal opportunity our national myth because upward mobility is becoming a statistical oddity. In fact, social mobility was remarkably stable during the period of since 1970. This slide shows that the adult income destinations of children born to parents in the lower and upper quartiles of the income distribution were largely unchanged since 1970, which contrasts with the broadly shared prosperity that characterized most of the 50s and 1960s. That made me happy to be born in 1950. Immobility at the lower end of the income distribution is especially problematic for higher education as the costs of college rise faster than incomes. This slide reveals that most of the intergenerational mobility in income occurs to children whose parents fall in the middle of the income distribution. Approximately 1/5 of offspring from parents in the middle income end up in each of the quintiles as adults. That isn't the case for the others. This would be good news, except that the middle class has shrunk since 1970, just when population diversification gained momentum and social mobility stagnated. My colleague Alan Kruger, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, estimated that the middle class, defined as households, the share of households with annual income within 1/2 of the national median, fell 8 percentage points as the income distribution became more unequal. For those in the lowest quartile of the income distribution, college affordability is a growing challenge. According to the NCES, the National Council on Education Statistics, college tuition rose 147% between 1980 and 2010, thus exacerbating the opportunity myth for growing numbers of youth whose college aspirations will either result in crushing debt or deferred dreams. The recession widened the wealth gap even further, but make no mistake, our nation's pulling apart has been underway for several decades. The two master trends I've sketched, rising inequality and population diversification, suggest that the nation has drifted away from commitments to equal opportunity espoused in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. Notwithstanding continued opposition to affirmative action in college admissions and large disparities in college access by income levels, the national diversification narrative has been felt throughout the education system. In fact, undergraduate student population has also become racially heterogeneous. In 1980, blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians represented 17% of all undergraduates, but by 2010, their combined shares more than doubled to 38%, quite similar to the national population share. What's more, this increased diversification of undergraduate enrollment occurred even as the size of the population of students increased 72%, which is more than the increase in the national population. Completion rates, however, represent a less optimistic picture. Among students who are enrolled in college in 2004, for example, and this is going to follow a cohort, 4- and 6-year graduation rates are consistently highest for white and Asian students and lowest for African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans. Less than half of all students who first matriculated in college in 2004 received their degrees in 4 years, but 41% of white students and nearly half of Asian students did so, compared with about 1/5 to 1/4 of blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. By 2010, 6 years after initially enrolling, about 2/3 of Asian and white students had earned a college degree, compared with only 2 in 5 African Americans and Native Americans, and about half of Hispanics. Explanations for these observed differentials in completions abound in the academic literature, but my reasons for illustrating them are to ask, whether institutions are as committed to retention and completion as they are to diversifying admissions and enrollment. How is the goal of inclusion served by persisting differentials in completion rates along racial and ethnic lines? Paralleling the trends in graduate degree enrollment, the composition of students seeking advanced degrees also became more racially heterogeneous, although less so than the undergraduate student population. Even as the number of degree holders surged 73% between 1980 and 2010, enrollment of Black and Hispanic graduate students rose. In recent research, I have focused on the transition from the baccalaureate to graduate programs and was surprised to learn that, conditional on graduating from college, Blacks and Hispanics are actually more likely than whites to enroll in graduate school, and they do so at a faster rate. This figure, which graphs the cumulative percent of a college graduation cohort ever enrolled in graduate school by race, reveals that the enrollment advantage of non-white students relative to whites persists over the 10-year period after college graduation. Hispanics and Asians enrolled the earliest, followed by Blacks. Initially, I thought that the graduate school enrollment advantage of Blacks and Hispanics reflected positive selection, that is, conditional on actually finishing, that they would be a smaller subset of the entire distribution. However, additional analyses disconfirmed this hunch because they actually averaged lower grades and GRE scores than whites. I point this out not to question whether the admitted students are capable, because they obviously have succeeded, but rather to ask whether the aggressive recruitment of minority students is matched by the retention strategies to ensure equal completion rates. The evidence on this question is mixed. This is a Department of Education tabulation which reported that Blacks and Hispanics have lower completion rates among those who ever enrolled in an advanced degree program. Among BA recipients who enrolled, approximately 2/3 of whites and Asians received a degree, compared with 55% and 57% of African American and Hispanic students, respectively. My estimates, however, take into account both the timing of enrollment, not just ever enrolled, and the type of graduate institution, and they tell a somewhat different story. We found that students who attended research institutions are significantly more likely to pursue postgraduate degrees than their counterparts who attended liberal arts or comprehensive institutions, and are also more likely to complete their programs. As this slide shows, Black and Hispanic college graduates are underrepresented at research institutions, which provide the strongest pathways to the advanced degrees. That Black college graduates are slightly overrepresented at liberal arts colleges largely reflects their enrollment at historically Black colleges. But once these differences are accounted for, we find no significant difference in completion rates. So this is where we are today. The well-known pipeline remains intact through advanced degrees. After all, Bakke and Grutter were about access to medical school and law school. Circling back to the diversification narrative, I appreciate that the aggregate trends in college and graduate school enrollment do not address the enormous variation in racial diversity among selective and open admission campuses. Nor do I believe or claim that proportionality should be used as a measure of social justice. My purpose in outlining the macro-demographic context is to illustrate that higher education has participated in the changing demographic landscape, and that the pace of diversification in higher education enrollment was equally rapid. The significance of campus diversification for inclusion is less clear, however, as the persisting completion gaps attest. As I argue below, achieving a diverse student body is but a pragmatic first step toward the broader goal of social integration. Despite our heritage as a liberal democracy, as a nation, we have struggled with conceptions of inclusion and fairness in many domains, including, perhaps especially education, which is the key stepping stone to social mobility. History shows us simply merely outlining discrimination, outlawing it, neither equalized nor educational opportunities, nor created the just society to which Pruitt alluded. Before the landmark Brown decision, legal scholars questioned whether integration was necessary for equality of opportunity, but since that time, the legal and political controversy has focused on the acceptable means for integration. Whether the educational benefits of demographic heterogeneity justify the use of race preferences as a means to diversify campuses remains hardly contested. To be sure, a diverse student body provides necessary conditions for leveraging educational benefits, but by itself does not guarantee inclusion. For the time remaining, I question whether diversification has been accompanied by integration, and in particular, the opportunities for robust exchange of ideas, especially different viewpoints required for learning. Since the 2003 Grutter decision, much scholarship has documented the positive benefits of diversity on campus and in the workplace. In this highly influential book, The Difference, Scott Page argues that diversity trumps ability in problem solving when it involves collections of people with non-redundant skills and experiences. This is certainly the philosophy behind the design of interdisciplinary programs positioned to forge new scientific frontiers by bringing together scholars from distinct theoretical orientations and who use varied analytical approaches. However, this heterogeneity is but a necessary ingredient for achieving the socially legitimate goal of integration. Its achievement is not automatic. Rather, because of the human tendencies to assemble in, quote, islands of comfortable consensus, unquote, integration must be strategically and deliberately cultivated through interactions that engage the diverse experiences of students from different geographic, religious, political, and racial backgrounds. In the words of Tori Harding Smith, who is the president of Washington and Jefferson College, humans do not leave to chance that which they value, unquote. So academic administrators do seem to understand that learning is impoverished when it occurs among homogeneous groups of like-minded people. But are they maximizing these differences of unlike-minded people? Indeed, there's mounting evidence showing that students who interact with peers from different racial and ethnic backgrounds develop more positive attitudes, academic and social self-concepts. They graduate at higher rates. They achieve superior leadership skills. They have higher levels of civic involvement and, importantly, exhibit lower levels of prejudice after graduation. But diversity is also a double-edged sword, as emphasized by affirmative action opponents, who equate the elusive critical mass with disguised quotas. Continued opposition to the use of race in college admissions warrants unequivocal evidence showing how institutions harness these pedagogic benefits of diversity. Much was made during preparations to argue the Grutter case about the need for the critical mass in order to avoid isolation and achieve meaningful diversity, whatever that is. How many members of underrepresented groups are needed so that students do not feel socially or intellectually isolated? This question has not been satisfactorily answered, either in absolute or relative terms, and unfortunately has deflected attention from the ultimate goal of campus diversification, namely the integration that is achieved through interaction in multiple domains, through collective problem solving, and through the robust exchange of ideas. This photo, which is taken from a lead article in Princeton Alumni Weekly, is an apt illustration of Washington and Jefferson College President Harding Smith's admonition to engage in visible diversity. To most observers, Robbie George and Cornel West are different in obvious ways. One is black, one is white, one is tall, one is short, one sports a beard, the other is clean-shaven. But that's not why the cover page with caricatures was dubbed the odd couple. Rather, they are an intriguing pair because of their orthogonal ideological perspectives. Robert George is a self-described conservative and devout Catholic. Cornel West is a liberal public intellectual. As external proof of their credentials, during the semester that they co-taught a freshman seminar, George visited the Pope and West met Hugo Chavez. This odd couple taught a freshman seminar in 2007 that not only riveted a handful of lucky students, but also fostered their own intellectual awakening as they refined their own ideas through vigorous intellectual exchange. Their disagreements about race and the possibility of achieving a colorblind society re-engaged visible and invisible diversity, when West argued that some groups, such as African Americans, feel alienated on Princeton's campus, and George quipped that he thought the alienated groups were the conservatives. Admittedly, the odd couple would be super odd if West was a staunch conservative and George was a left-leaning liberal, as proponents of the critical mass would claim. But when engaged in an academic setting, their contrasting ideological views proved sufficient. Based on student interviews, there was enormous benefit to witnessing and discussing their distinct approaches to common readings. In short, the pedagogic benefits of diversity were enormous. How this seminar came about is not part of an institutional strategy to engage diverse views. Rather, it was a fortuitous result of an interview between two men arranged by a student that both men had taught. Serendipity can and often does lead to innovation, as in this instance, where this entrepreneurial student who knew both professors served as the link. However, it's fair to ask whether the formidable yet critical challenges of capitalizing on diversity in order to enrich learning environments should be left to chance. This anecdote serves to illustrate 2 points. First, diversities relevant to pedagogic missions transcend the demographic traits and include less discernible but equally consequential differences in ideological perspectives, social class, values, religious beliefs, and the like. And second, institutions committed to diversifying their campuses must be equally committed to dedicated to harnessing the pedagogic benefits through deliberate strategies to engage diverse views. Disagreement more than consensus is the source of learning. Non-redundant experiences are more important for solving daunting social problems. Comparison is key for understanding individual experience. My own work on the Hispanic population has always been comparative, with blacks, whites, and Asians. It is through systematic analysis of similarities and differences that I came to understand what Hispanicity means, whether it is an enduring or transitory phenomenon, and the likely integration prospects of newcomers. In short, I learned about Hispanics by studying non-Hispanics. Critics of race preferences also claim that race-sensitive admissions geared to achieving group-specific critical masses reproduce racial divisions through self-segregation, which are then reinforced institutionally via ethnic studies programs, ethnic-themed houses, and the proliferation of group-specific cultural events, all of which allegedly undermine cross-group interaction. I emphasize allegedly because the evidence is mixed. Given the banter about the critical mass notion during oral arguments at the October hearing of Fisher versus the University of Texas, both criticisms do need to be addressed. Before doing so, it's appropriate to consider why intergroup sorting occurs under conditions of rapid diversification, as witnessed in the United States generally and in higher education specifically. Invoking insights from cognitive dissonance theory, Crisp and Melidi explain that both the pace and scope of social differentiation trigger resistance to integration, partly because the evolutionary timescale of human cognitive capacities has not kept pace with the globalization of actual group experiences. This chart summarizes their thesis, building on several key insights from cognitive and evolutionary psychology, namely, that humans have an evolved propensity to think categorically about groups, that humans have an evolved preference for homogeneity and stability, that the cognitive apparatus involves the two systems that are activated to distinguish friends from foes for coalition building, and that there's a tipping point that engages the cognitive system that is conducive to integration. The tipping point may be a critical mass, but not necessarily, as South Africa's long-standing apartheid system shows. The coalition detection system is protective and reinforces group boundaries. The coalition building system is triggered when preconceptions of others are challenged, and especially when they're shattered. You're not like the rest of them. I'm not sure that shatters. In homogeneous local systems, this two-tiered system serves human populations well to distinguish friend from foe, but it's poorly aligned to the realities of multicultural societies like the United States. Social integration in multicultural environments requires activation of this coalition building system to resolve this cognitive dissonance that arises from positive cross-group encounters. In their words, quote, social diversity results in cooperative and tolerant behavior only when it requires one to think beyond the ancestral building blocks of modern society, unquote. Put differently, to foster integration, it's necessary to engage members of different groups in activities that challenge these pre-existing stereotypes about others, however defined, Muslim and Christian, black and brown, male and female. Crisp and Melidi's argument has several implications for the integration strategies available to institutions of higher education. Because most students arrive with their coalition detection systems engaged, whether they're aware of this or not, bringing together socially, economically, demographically, and ideologically diverse groups of students likely reproduces the group boundaries. To foster integration, therefore, higher education institutions require active strategies to inhibit these natural tendencies for students to fall back on these coalition detection system by self-sorting themselves into these homogeneous social niches. So given how the dual cognitive system operates, it's clear that neither the educational benefits of diversity nor the broader goal of mission of integration will occur even when critical masses, whatever that is, are achieved. What's more, integration may actually be hampered by students' proclivity to sort into racially homogeneous groups. So studies of segregation mostly focus on residents, and they measure cross-group interaction using an index of exposure, which reflects likely contact between groups based on experiences atypical. These measures are very sensitive to the size of the different population groups. But they're not very particularly helpful on college campuses where the context of interaction range from team sports to classrooms to dorms and everything in between. My colleague Thomas Espenshade and his collaborator Alexandra Radford conducted a comprehensive study of campus life at several post-secondary institutions that pretty much represent the size and selectivity of universities nationally. Importantly, their survey asked students about their interactions with classmates of different races across several domains, and also whether they participated in ethnic studies courses. I can't pretend to do justice to their nuanced coverage of this subject, but I'll highlight some of the key findings that are relevant for concerns about meaningful integration that have been the focus of affirmative action critics. Espenshade and Radford conclude that general socializing in the first two bars is the most common way that racially distinct groups interact on college campuses. These bars represent the percent of classmates who socialize frequently with members of the same or other races. Unquestionably, there is far more interaction within than between racial groups, yet nearly 2/3 of students report that they socialize often or very often with other race groups. It's also noteworthy that half of the students, respondents, live with roommates of another race, and half report cross-race friendships. Given the pervasiveness of residential and school segregation in the United States, these patterns on campus are notable. Aida Hurtado, former president of the Education Association, has emphasized that the frequency, quality, and context of interaction determines whether cross-group relations shatter these pre-existing stereotypes in ways that further the goal of social integration. Because the most prevalent cross-group interaction involves general socializing, this tabulation unpacks the underlying behaviors by race. There are several noteworthy points. First, whites tend to keep largely to themselves, with 96% reporting that they often or very often socialize with other whites. Hispanics are most likely to socialize with members of other groups, possibly because of our ambivalent status in the racial U.S. hierarchy. Most of us have an easier time passing as white. Asians and blacks are intermediate between these extremes, with between 81 and 86% respectively reporting that they often or very often socialize with members of their own racial group. Odds ratios based on the frequency of contact between group pairs to contact with their own group are useful metrics to reveal the implied social distances in the prior table. Cross-racial interactions involving whites most frequently occur with Hispanics and to a lesser extent Asians. However, blacks and Asians are 80% less likely to interact with each other than with members of their own group. Whites are least likely to socialize frequently with other African Americans. These social distance patterns are very, very similar to those based on national data about group attitudes towards each other. What is unclear is whether these interaction patterns result from exclusion or self-segregation. Equally important is whether these interaction patterns reflect any progress toward integration. Yes and no. Yes, because there's evidence of cross-group socializing. No, because the amount of cross-group of social contact within racial groups is far greater than that between groups. Racial boundaries are clearly evident in socializing behavior, but there appears to be considerable permeability in these boundaries, especially for Hispanics and to a lesser extent Asians. Both groups offer promising openings to foster campus integration. I understand that it's convenient to focus on so-called minorities for their tendency to hang together. For large majorities of Black and Latino youth, this is the only world they have ever known. For as much progress as has been made toward integration in the societal level, even today there are communities where integrated proms are new ideas. Take Wilcox County, Georgia, where at the initiative of 2 white and 2 black students, their school sponsored its first integrated prom this past spring. That's 2013. Since school desegregation in the 70s, Wilcox County schools turned blind eyes to the persistent practice of segregated proms, allegedly because they were private, invitation-only affairs organized by their parents. But in 2004, Toombs County, Georgia also made national news when it sponsored 3 proms, 1 black, 1 white, and 1 Latino. These behavioral norms carry over to higher education, where boundaries theoretically can be dismantled, but often are reproduced. So I ask you, if integration cannot be a table stake for universities' diversity aspirations, then where? If not now, then when? If not at the institutions that desperately seek to diversify their student bodies, then where? Are administrators also complicit in the slow pace of campus integration? To what extent these patterns reflect this uneven distribution of groups across fields of study is unclear, but there's additional evidence for self-segregation in patterns of ethnic coursework. Yet again, among students who enroll in courses with ethnic studies content, there's a clear tendency for minority groups to enroll in courses consonant with their own identity, with black students most likely to do so. Furthermore, it's striking that relatively low shares of white students enroll in ethnic studies courses. To the extent that the content of ethnic studies courses is germane for challenging pre-existing stereotypes, the racial differentials in enrollment patterns are troubling. Student clubs further perpetuate the maintenance of these boundaries. On my own campus, there were no less than 6 Hispanic organizations until last spring, when the 2 largest merged. This is something I had encouraged because it runs contrary to the goal of integration. By organizing along national origin lines, the student organizations miss important opportunities to learn how they are different, but more importantly, that meaningful similarities trump these symbolic differences. I learned that there are even more Asian student organizations on campus, some differentiating by language within nationalities. The impetus partly stems from the vast availability at my wealthy campus of funds for student activities, and partly from the overly flexible criteria for group formation on campus. So in this instance, the university is a tacit enabler, just like the school board in Wilcox County, Georgia. Harsh. The takeaway is not that ethnic studies programs should be avoided, quite the opposite. Ethnic studies programs serve an important pedagogical function, but one that is less consequential for the project of integration if their reach is largely confined to their own group members. Rather, I conclude from this experience that institutions have an important responsibility to build cross-disciplinary programs in ways that maximize heterogeneous enrollment so that they do not become these islands of comfortable consensus. My ideal is for no more than 50% enrollment in ethnic studies programs to consist of own group members, but I won't object to 60-40. I've argued, as have many others, that enrollment of underrepresented groups is but a pragmatic first step for the goal of inclusion. Presence on campus neither guarantees integration into campus life, nor does it lead to the realization of the pedagogic benefits of diversity, which is one of the core arguments used to justify an exception to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The mission of higher education is not to align the representation of the citizenry with its student population, but rather to foster integration in order to reap pedagogic benefits. Learning is greatly compromised when universities permit the proliferation of havens for homogeneous groups of like-minded people. As a core foundation of good citizenship, racial diversification of higher education institutions is both a pedagogic interest and an interest in democratic legitimacy. As such, it is necessary for educational institutions to be visibly integrated. Writing for the majority in the Grutter opinion, Grutter versus Bollinger decision, Justice O'Connor supported the continuous use of narrowly tailored race-sensitive admissions by arguing that our nation's public institutions should be pursuing the larger national project of integration, a project that is at the core of 21st century America's understanding of itself as democratically legitimate. I've added the emphasis. This argument resonates with Pruitt's questions at the outset about whether and how we can live together justly, and my specific concerns about whether diversification of colleges will reproduce existing race and class divisions or foster new forms of social cohesion. I believe the jury is out on both counts. Given the means to achieve racial diversity remain controversial, it would serve the common good if higher education leaders led the charge to demonstrate how inclusive learning environments serve national interests. We declare, we don't demonstrate. This requires a concerted focus on inclusion rather than campus diversification per se, which is but a pragmatic first step to the socially legitimate goal of inclusion. It behooves institutional leaders to make integration the focus of diversity initiatives, to demonstrate that diversity and inclusion serve compelling national interests, to align campus diversification with achievement and graduation, and to track and institutionalize the best practices. Lessons from the private sector that link a broad array of metrics to the financial bottom line do not fit with the culture of universities, where intellectual output does not lend itself to standardized accounting message systems. So we are told. But that may be more excuse than reality. Higher education institutions are in the business of evaluation. Students are graded on their coursework, faculty are graded on their teaching, and on their research productivity, and universities regularly track their applicant admit and enrollment pools so that they can withstand legal scrutiny, and they do track their budgets. It's not unreasonable then to ask university administrators whether their verbal commitments to diversity is matched by their success in attracting and retaining students from underrepresented groups, and in closing racial disparities in completion rates. Given the large economic and social inequalities that accompany the diversification narrative, closing graduation gaps is the key for the democratic legitimacy, as Justice O'Connor opined. It's also possible to leverage diversity for pedagogic benefit and for the project of integration by providing incentives for cross-race initiatives, courses, and peer-led activities that work against these evolved human preferences for homogeneity, for stability, simplicity, and structure. More generally, if leaders of higher education institutions genuinely believe that racial diversity enhances the pedagogic mission of their institutions, then it behooves them to continually develop innovative strategies to maximize the learning benefits, to demonstrate what works and what doesn't, and institutionalize these best practices as if their survival depended on visible integration. Thank you.
Professor Tienda will be happy to answer some questions. So,
so while you're here, I have to ask you about, I guess, I would call it Richard Sanders' work on the mismatch hypothesis, but I think that I might more accurately convey my thoughts about his work in terms of calling it the so-called mismatch, so-called hypothesis. And I wonder if that, so that sort of conjecture of Sanders, how that would, if you might be able to explain it to the audience a little more.
I can. In fact, this is the second time I've spoken before a legal audience. The first time was dismantling his work.
Well, yeah, which, by the way,
so he's basically arguing, and I've produced statistical evidence to the contrary. The argument is that by admitting young people, and I told you that when I looked at the higher enrollment rates in advanced degree programs of blacks and Hispanics, and faster over all this period, that I thought that we were selecting on the most, those who had succeeded. After all, they'd beat the odds. And so I would have thought that they would have been more selective, but in fact they weren't on average. So the argument goes that by admitting people of color with lower scores on average than whites, that we're setting them up for failure. But my work on Texas, which the top 10% law that it gave automatic admission to students who graduated in the top 10% of their class as a measure of merit based on grades, showed that they outperformed students with test scores 200 to 300 points higher. So we have this fixation on test scores as if they are a reliable measure of merit, and they are not. So Sanders argues that the problem of the non-success has to do with this mismatch, and that students would be better off if they went to less selective institutions. And the problem is that that isn't the case for the following reason. If you just look within an institution, the comparison is of those who are admitted, let's say, at Yale. And on average, minorities have lower performance there. But they would have even worse performance if they went to a less selective institutions because they don't have the social infrastructure, the support structure to ensure success. So when you do the counterfactual, the appropriate counterfactual to ask this question, which he does not do, is to say, what would these students have done had they actually attended a lower ranked school? There's a statistical way to do it, and I did it 4 different statistical ways, and the answer was the same. That is, they would have had lower outcomes, lower success rates, had they gone to a less selective institution. And we've looked at it with several different data sets, national data sets, and the data set that Bill Bowen used for Shape of the River. So he's just wrong. Sorry. But that's the argument. He was at a session after the Fisher decision in this summer in Cleveland, and he is much more mild today. I don't know if it's because I was in the room, but. The mismatch, actually, they used to call it the fit hypothesis, and then I said, it's not really the fit, it's the misfit. And I thought, I don't like that word, so we started using the mismatch, and now it's used. But I can send you a couple of articles to show, to demonstrate the results of that and where it's published. So.
Other questions?
So what do you see as, I guess, things or items that contribute to a student's success in higher education? What are the things that are more impactful, whether it be the social environment of the university, or is there any other factors that you have found?
You know, I was quite impressed with Scott Page's presentation at Princeton. Princeton now has a big diversity initiative. So we've decided that the undergraduate program, and it is institution-wide. I mean, everybody's been talked to, from people who hire, from the staff, from the grad school. They've decided that the grad school and the faculty are going to be the priorities. And the reason they're doing it is because the percent female faculty started to go down, and we had a female president for 12 years. And there's always a challenge at the graduate school. So the graduate schools, which is where a lot of the litigation takes place, but the solutions are made for the undergraduate program. I mean, go figure. They're really trying to build this initiative, and I think there has to be an institutional commitment at the top, whether it's to hire low-income students, to maintain low-income students and make sure that they have what it takes to succeed. Oftentimes, it's this correlation between class and race, because the diverse students, the minority students, tend to come from lower backgrounds, and halfway through they're freaking out about where they're going to pay the tuition, and they're working part-time, and many students are not working. So it's a combination of several things that lead to this problem. So Princeton has decided to make this a priority. But just having them on campus is necessary but not sufficient. And one of the things that has worried me, and I never tried to parlay into this, I avoided it actually deliberately. I did at Wisconsin. I didn't want to be assigned to do work about the Chicano Studies program, and they tried to do it at the university. I said, you're doing this twice. The next time I'm going to lead the charge to dismantle this program, because I don't work on this. And there's no reason that you should use my externalities to further a problem that you can't solve. You either make a commitment to the program, but don't create this marginal program. And that kind of pandering that happens a lot, I think, is one of the problems. So institutions respond in a half-hearted way. So yes, we're going to do a Latino Studies program. I started the Latino Studies certificate program at Princeton, not because I thought that that should be my responsibility, but I figured after I chaired the National Academy panel on Hispanics and the future of the country, given how fast the group is growing, given the educational inequities, that there were a lot of issues for an aging population that should be focused on capitalizing and investing in our young people. I thought that would be a propitious time to think about this. And so we have the program, but I also said it should be in American studies. It shouldn't be an island. It should be part of the national mosaic. And now we're having, they didn't do it initially. Presumably it was because we had a budget crisis in 2008. But there was a lot of bantering about, it was awful. It was probably one of the low points of my time there when I realized that there was, it was student-led, and they had tried for several years, and I didn't want to get involved. And then I felt, okay, now it's socially, it's legitimate. It's been established intellectually as a concern that we need to think about. And after the program was announced on blogs, there was some really ugly hate mail going back and forth among our students. About, well, why should we be doing this program? Don't use any of my tuition dollars for those programs. I mean, it was really uncomfortable. So we have a ways to go. Some of those things don't show up visibly, and I think if people want to write that in blogs, they should sign their name rather than do it under the veil of anonymity. Because that, at least you know what you have to deal with when somebody says, my best friends are Mexican. Well, at least you know that you have something to deal with. But when somebody just pretends, those invisible differences, those cognitive things that don't show up are problematic. So it remains to be seen whether we're going to achieve these goals of diversification at the faculty. I don't think just bringing in people for their own sake so we can show, yeah, we can count who we hire, who we promote and the like. That's good, but I really resent lowering standards just to keep somebody on because they are of color. Because then we reify stereotypes that we are not capable of succeeding in the same terms. So we are past that, and there are the stories we used to hear in the 60s and 70s, we can't find qualified minorities. That's history. Get over it. Now do something about it, and then work with it to go beyond just having somebody present. That's a necessary but insufficient condition, as I showed with the discussion between Cornell West and Robbie George. So we're trying to do it. It has to begin at the top, and I commend Ruth Simmons, who was a former president of Brown. I served on her board. Because when the recession hit, and here's where you see the commitment, whereas Princeton has a much bigger endowment than Brown, kind of gave us some beans for the Latino Studies program. I said, I don't want it to be a stepchild. Either you do it or you don't. And we're kind of a stepchild. Ruth, when they were going through their organizational review of where we're going to cut, how we're going to balance these things, one of the things she said, she had worked so hard to get race-blind admissions, and she said, financial aid is not on the table to cut. We can't go back. That was not negotiable. And the board supported that because there was a commitment from the top. And the president of Jefferson and Washington College also has made a commitment. She illustrates these exchanges that take place in classrooms that engage these invisible diversities. I know it's hard, but that's why it's worth doing. And Jeff Page's book illustrates it so clearly when you have these non-redundant skills that allow people to work together and show that each has an insight that's different, and that is so key for problem solving. So diverse experiences can be very beneficial in creativity, but they have to be engaged, and they're not sufficiently.
Why are Native American students not showing up? Is it a function of where your interests lie in the research, or are they just not showing up in graduate school?
They're not showing up because their numbers are so small, and many of the tabulations do not even put them separately. So we can see, and relative to the size of the total pie, their relative share has gone down over time. And so then in higher education, we did not only just separate but equal, but separate but unequal, but we had the tribal colleges. And the pathways from the tribal colleges to higher education are even more narrow than they are between the comprehensive universities and the liberal arts institutions and the research universities. So the question is this sorting across research universities and non-universities. That to me was very instructive. I came into this saying, why do we have all these summer programs for creating research research experiences to cultivate and to bring this pipeline to graduate school? And so I thought the implicit hypothesis is that giving students from other universities research experience is going to get them connected to research and the idea of going on to graduate school. If you're bringing students from research universities, they kind of already have that. So I think what we need to do is focus on those comprehensive institutions where we have a disproportionate number of blacks and Hispanics attending. They're attending places where the main job is teaching, and they are not being exposed to research. And coming from an institution where your dean will tell you every single student has to write a senior thesis of about 100 pages. And the tension starts when they're freshmen and it builds up in sophomore. Then they have junior papers, and then like the rubber's hitting the road, and then they become seniors. And there's just this tension that just builds over the semester as they learn to under one-on-one. So we have a very good faculty-student ratio that requires that every student work one-on-one with a faculty member over a year. It's a lot of work. But at the end of the time, we can write letters that are very substantive. So they have an advantage. When you're teaching a class of 300 and you do 6 classes a year, it's very hard to get to know students. And you can't give them structured research experiences.
I'm really sympathetic and interested in the proposals, but one of the things that, in terms of a commitment at the top and so forth, but one of the things that strikes me especially about student organizations, is that the reasons for students dropping out and like sometimes relate to things like social support and all of that. And it seems to me that it'd be very attractive for administrators or institutions to say, well, let's have no more of these silos of these clubs or these groups, and that would be depriving students of some source of comforts or benefits, whereas what might really be good would be harder for the administrators to do, which is to say, for instance, make it a core course or a required course for everyone to take a course in, cultural studies or African American studies or something like that, and just say, we know that you need this, so we're going to make this a required course, but we wouldn't want to start at eliminating the, Latino Students Association or something like that.
Right, and so I said that I'm not arguing against ethnic studies programs. What worries me is that they become islands of comfortable consensus. When you look at the distribution, the composition of students who enroll in those classes, they become self-serving. And where did I get some of these ideas? It's one of the things about being older is that you have more experience. I taught a freshman seminar on the Latino experience after I had done the National Academy panel. In fact, I used the report for the students. They had access to it even before it was released. That's Princeton for you. But the second time I taught it in the spring, and it was really cool. It had a very diverse body, and I saw firsthand what the diversity of experiences was. It was amazing. When I had one unit called Latinos in Princeton, which meant in the town as well as in the university, and the readings for that week were 10 years of newspaper clippings from the town and the university, the Princeton Weekly, whatever, our weekly newspaper, and the students, the prints. So you could see the evolution of what topics were being covered as the population grew, and some of it wasn't all really nice initially. It was, oh, look at this, we have this culturally group, and they started the store on Lee Street, and now we have issues of immigration and illegal, and the dog bit one, and it really changed the tenor. And what was important about this is that the students, it brought them out. By that point, they had changed their point of reference from in my high school to my experience in Princeton. And one young man pointed out that at the day, they had this one day, they fill up the gym and students sign up for clubs. And this Latino kid went naively to go sign up, I think correctly, but he goes to sign up to the Asian Studies dance group. And they said, what are you doing here? And he reported that about not fitting in. And another young lady who was raised in a totally white neighborhood was oblivious to the fact that there is segregation, rejection, exclusion, said, what? I can't believe that they wouldn't let you join. And then everybody else, it was an experience, an exchange that another student said, I learned so much from my colleagues in this class. So you know that they are engaging with, and that young lady who didn't know, who was from upstate New York, totally white neighborhood, chemistry major, but she studied self-segregation. She wanted to know why the students were sitting in groups in the cafeteria. Was it self-imposed? Did they feel equally comfortable? I was a faculty fellow in one of the dorms. I would go and try to sit with students, and it's like the plague on your house they would avoid. You know, it was, you know, we're supposed to go there and eat with the students so that you can talk to them, and I always would try to do that, but if you don't go sit in there where they're already there, they're not gonna sit with you. They just like, oh. So those are the kinds of things that start making a difference, but they have to be cultivated by themselves. They don't, for the reasons that I explained, that it's fear of rejection. Until the stereotype is shattered, there is that fear. So who's going to take the first step? And what should it consist of? So for the ethnic studies programs, keep them. By all means, let's educate each other, but not educate ourselves only, right? So that's where we need to say that what I said was 50%, I'd settle for 60-40, but we cannot have these courses only about ourselves. It's a sociology of me and the politics of me. We're learning from cross-group experiences. I never knew I was different until I was told I was, and I wanted to know why. But so what I said about comparison is important. If you don't make it, then you go on assuming. And it's those stereotypes that really have done us so much disservice. Everybody who gets admitted belongs, and I spend my time telling students I say, you think you don't belong here, don't you? Yeah, I'm not feeling comfortable. I said, listen, they picked you because there was something in your application, I don't know what it was, that made you stand out. You belong here, just find your niche. Find your niche. And, you know, after a while, most of them do eventually. But you have to feel that you belong, and that isn't always the case. So I'm proud of the group that formed Princeton Latinos y Amigos. Amigos means everybody can join. And I use that as an example of what is possible. And I counted the number of clubs that have an ethnic content was just mortifying. I put it in a written version of this. I did it afterwards, and I thought, oh, Lord have mercy. But so that shouldn't allow, and we enable it. Most places don't enable it to that extent, but there should be a balance, right? This is a place to have it on campuses, but it shouldn't then become the source of segregation.
Well, I guess that's what I'm concerned about, is that for administrators, it seems to me that would be the easiest thing to demonstrate. Your commitment to that is to get rid, to discourage those clubs, the student organizations, not the studies, the program study, but the clubs. And especially when you have a really small group, right. It seems to me that one of the things that you do then, if you don't match it then with some sort of opportunity where they're going to have explore those differences, is that then you just prevent those students from having.
Well, let me just point out that if you look at sports, how integrated are they? I served as the mentor for the men and women's tennis team. I rode around in a bus even. And tennis is predominantly white. Look what happened to the lacrosse team at Brown. It was all white except for one African American, and he was not taken as, he was considered he couldn't have possibly been a perpetrator, because that's a white sport, right? And it was whites versus these dancers. And so in basketball, except at places that don't recruit, I mean, you see these systematic sorting, and it is what it is, but it's harder than one thinks. And that means that these are kids who sort and they interact together. That becomes their natural setting. And by default, unless some steps are taken to go beyond that, I'm not taking away their skill, but because these high-class, expensive sports tend to be predominantly white, then what are we going to do in addition to that? How can we get them involved? It means more than just community service. We're going to go pick up trash in Trenton Day. I mean literally, systematically more encounters, so that these stereotypes like Robbie George and Cornell West did in front of these students who just were bewildered. Who knew? And that was an accident. And that's why I say institutions cannot leave to chance what they value. And that's what happens. So how many other institutions do the same thing? It means going beyond. And that, if you're going to make a commitment to diversity, then go all the way. If you hit a tennis ball halfway, and I never played tennis, I wish I had learned. If you hit it halfway, it goes anywhere. You have to hit it all the way to get the follow-through. We need the follow-through. We need the follow-through, because everybody can succeed. I know. I didn't come from a silver spoon. There were no books in my house. My father had less than sixth grade education. My mother did as well. You know, it's hard work, but it's possible if we let our students know that we believe in them. And I was lucky that there was, at every transition, there was somebody who believed in me. And that's all elaborating that little biography. But that is so critical to give self-esteem to students. But we have to nurture those cross-group socializing. We can't have segregated proms. These kids had only had experienced segregation, and we can't have segregation on campus. We can't allow it. If we want to diversify our campuses, it's not just about the numbers and the demography, it's about the project of integration. And then we won't have to answer the Supreme Court, what is a critical mass?
We have time for one more question. Rob?
Hi, so what kind of evidence does Page rely on to support the conclusion that integration benefits, yields benefits in this education context?
Diversity benefits, because what he does is he provides several examples. There's, if you want to see his lecture, it's online. He gave a lecture at Princeton. He's given it at several other places, so it's online under Princeton website. Look under Diversity Initiative. You should find it there. It's very interesting because he gives several examples, and he shows how groups that bring different skills, and oftentimes the people from disadvantaged backgrounds bring one or two, but if you have kids who have high scores and high this and that, they tend to have many redundant skills. And there's a plethora of research showing that the redundant skills aren't going to give you the advantage, the leverage. And so they do it in several applications. And so he goes through that very, very systematically. But having non-redundant skills that don't interact is not helpful. Right? And that's the challenge. So this self-segregation or imposed whatever it is, there has to be a balance between this. I hadn't paid attention to this when I was at Stanford. They had the ethnic houses, and I thought, oh, that's nice. And so there was some sorting, but they also put a limit on the maximum number of the own group who could be in the house. So that could be one way. You can have an ethnic house, but you cap it so that no more than 50% of the same group are in the house. One of the things you notice on the slide about different roommates, that's because universities impose that at least for a year, and then they allow them to pick their own roommates. So then the sorting takes place. So we don't want to force roommates after the first year, right? Because then that is, what if they don't get along? But I learned when I was an undergraduate at Michigan State how contentious this can be, and where we attribute to class what is really people problems. And I did not know we had over admitted students, and the girls from the inner city, there were 2 African Americans, and they bring them in 1 week in advance to get special training. That was going to overcome 12 years of bad schools, but never mind. And so they arrive 1 week before, and they come in a room for 2 people, 3 people are in there. And they had already put up their signs, their posters, and the third one comes in, and I'm the RA on this floor, and the mom comes in from Birmingham, Michigan, a Jewish neighborhood, and she comes in, oh, Lydia, I can still remember this, it was so impactful. She said, Lydia, honey, I'll take care of this. We'll move you. And she said, Mom, leave it alone. I'm going to stay here, Mom. So it was fine, except that the 2 girls from the inner city were night people, and they would stay up late at night and get up really late. And Lydia was a morning person. She was at breakfast at 7 a.m. in the morning. So we had a people problem, a day problem. And if they were all black or all white, that would have been a roommate problem, and no problems, no questions asked. It turned into a whole university event, and there I was, 19, 20 years old, trying to solve, and all these people from special services are at my meeting, and I stood in the center, and I just looked at everybody, and I said, I don't know where I got this, but I did. I said, this is a people problem. This is a roommate problem of time of day. She's a breakfast person. They're not breakfast people. They're night people. And the way we solve this is by moving the roommates and matching them up on the time of day on their schedule. No questions. And it just sort of dissipated. It could have become a university event. But it's important to think through what are the differences. The visible one was race, but that wasn't it at all, any more than it was for Robbie George and Cornell West. So I think we have to also go beyond the appearances. right? Because we stereotype on the basis of those appearances. So there's a lot of work we can do, but if we don't do it at universities, where do you think it's going to be done? The business, I serve on corporate board, and the business community, they pay attention and they know how it works. And they watch it in action and they track it. We don't in universities, and yet we're supposed to be the leaders. We're the ones that are litigating these issues. They're not litigating them in the business sector. And Paige's book illustrates exactly how the businesses actually capitalize on it. You'd be surprised that when I was doing some research for some of these ideas, even the Boy Scouts of America has information about why inclusion furthers the activities of the Boy Scouts and why that is beneficial. And if the Boy Scouts can do it for young people, why can't we do it in higher education? Think.